So, hi, and welcome to this live webinar about the importance of shaping your knitting and more information about size and why it's always better to start with your own measurements. I'm so happy that you are here today, and for the next hour, we will be diving deep into the steps that you need to take to make more custom fit knits, either to yourself or to other knit-worthy people in your life. So to make the most out of this workshop, I suggest that you have a pen and a piece of paper to make some notes. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them. And you can chat any comments or any other things as well in there. So Shape Your Knitting is for every knitter who felt like a standard pattern doesn't quite fit them. Maybe you learned a few alterations, but you want to learn some more in order to make the perfect knit for you. This hour will change a little bit how you look at the pattern and open your eyes to make more custom fit knits. So I'm Johanna. I'm the founder and creator behind Skew Knitting Academy. It's a place where I share my knitting knowledge with you through online workshops and masterclasses. Knitting has followed me around since I was a child. I learned when I was about 8 years old from my grandma, and my grandma is still going strong, 93 years old at this point of time. And when our daughter was born in 2020, grandma actually knitted her some baby boots with some lace on them. So it's really fun to see how this craft carries on throughout our family. And knitting is truly a multi-generational craft. We all use the same basic stitches, but we come up with very different creations. So my grandma and I, we have, for example, very different approach to knitting a sock. She likes to knit with deep ends from the cuff down, and I like to knit from toe up with magic loop. But we both create a sock that gets worn and loved by the recipient, even though she most of the times use a pattern or experience on how many stitches to cast on, and I usually take the measurements of the recipient and go from there. One of the things that motivates me with the Skew Knitting Academy is that I want to share this feeling of the perfect fit. When you spend that many hours on a knitted project like you do, then when you have it finished, you want it to have the perfect fit. So when you try it on and you see that, oh, this is great, that's the feeling I want to give you after you have spent some time with me in Skew Knitting Academy. Shape Your Knitting, it starts with the question of, do you have issues with knitted things that don't fit or that you want to improve the fit of? Then this training will help you in the right direction to get rid of those issues once and for all. Fit and ease are two things that are very important when it comes to knitting. And I can for sure say that before, when I was guessing the size of whoever I was knitting to, things didn't quite turn out the way I wanted more times than it did turn out the way I wanted it. So have you ever done it like this? Guessed and hoped for the best to yourself or to someone else? I see some nodding, so I guess I'm on the right track here. Do you want to change this and be more mindful about your knitting to actually make some pieces that fits you? Then you're in absolutely the right place today. So I know knitting time is limited for almost all of us, and we want to spend it the best we can in order to make the best fit knit that we want to have. But in order to be really mindful about your knitting and to make the best knits that we can, we need to start in the right place for the right pattern with the right size and with the right measurements. No more guessing and hoping for the best. I was also one of these. I guessed and hoped for the best and tried to do it both for myself and for my husband. My husband is extremely knit-worthy, but he's not average size. So in this case, it was a question of his hats sitting on the top of his head and never covering his ears. So he was always cold. And no matter how many patterns I tried, they were always too small. And his socks constantly slid off his feet. And then after a while, I realized I actually needed to do something about this to make him knits that actually fit him. So even though it was not how I want to spend my precious knitting time, I took his measurements, I made all the calculations, and I did a custom fit pattern for him. Some time passed, I've knitted a couple of things for him, and now I'm really happy that I did take the measurements and took the time to do the calculations, because now things fit him. He have a hat that he has worn all winter, and it sits perfect on his head, and his socks don't slip off his feet any longer, and I don't have to mend them every few wears because he wears them too thin, too rapid. That doesn't happen anymore. He can use them over and over again, and that's really a relief, because mending socks is quite boring, even though I do it. But how do you go from following a pattern when knitting to more use a pattern as some inspiration? I would say that it starts even before you have decided what you want to knit. So before even casting on something to knit, there are a whole bunch of decisions that you make. Most of the time, I don't think you even make these decisions consciously. You just know that you want to knit this or that, or you want to knit something for this person, or you see that, oh, I'm in need of a new pair of mittens, for example. Or you see someone on Instagram or a YouTube channel or whatever who shows off this knit that you absolutely want to make. And it starts somewhere there with inspiration for a pattern, or with the feeling of someone actually needs what you can make them. Then you go and make some decisions about the yarn and the color, and maybe you feel like you want to have some blue socks. Then you go searching for the perfect blue sock yarn to make your perfect blue socks. Or you want to have several colors in a joked sweater. Then you go out and find all these colors. And after that, you will make a swatch so that you can have a feel for the fabric, and you can decide on which needles to use. Now, I know it's considered as high achieving to make a swatch, but a swatch will help you to get a better fit out of your garments. And we will talk more about the swatch in a few minutes. So now you have the yarn, you have the needles, and you have the swatch, and you know what you want to knit. Maybe you even have a pattern. Then it's time to take some measurements to make sure that your knitted garment will fit. What I actually done is I have taken all the measurements of myself, my husband, and my son, and I keep them on my phone in a notes app called Google Keep. And I found that one easy because it's accessible from my computer as well. And that's why I can't spell today. We'll go like this. There you have the name of the app. And I use it even though I have an iPhone. So it works in both ways, or in both Android and iPhone. Of course, you can use a physical notebook if you want to, or any other app or place where you want to put down these measurements. But I would say use something so you don't have to retake the measurements every time. Note them down, know where you have them, keep them there and use them. But retaking the measurements for every single knit that you want to make or need to make, then that gets quite tedious and a huge process instead of just taking them once. But when you take your measurements, it's easiest to be two people, one that needs the measurements taken and one that can take the measurements. Because when you try to take your measurements by yourself, there's always the risk of twisting the tape measure or that it slides down in one side. So get someone to help, note down your measurements, or you can even help someone else who also would like to take their measurements at the same time. Now, when taking the measurements, don't only take like the length of the foot or the bust measurements, because that won't really help with the fit. You need to take more measurements than only one. For example, when I knit my socks, I take 5 different measurements to ensure that I will have a good fit. There will be the length of the foot and then different circumferences to be used in both to calculate the width, the heel, and everything else that you need. But if you only do the length, like in the case in many different sock patterns, they only give you the shoe size and that only decides the length of the foot, then it's most likely that your sock will not fit the best it can. But which measurements to take does depend on the item you want to knit. If you're planning on knitting a sweater, then most patterns will use the bust measurement to determine which size you want to make. I will argue that you also at least need the shoulder-to-shoulder measurements to ensure that you have a sweater that sits nicely on your shoulders. And if it sits better on your body, then you will likely to wear it more, you would likely to like it more, and it would look more flattering on your body. I'm not saying that the bust measurement is non-important, but there are more measurements that are important. So make sure to take them and note them down, and you will have a better fitting knit at the end. But how can you know which measurements to take and which measurements are actually in the pattern? Well, you can have a look at the pattern and have a look for the schematic or the size chart. And there you will see which measurements the designer has used when he or she designed the pattern. And they will most oftentimes give you the finished measurements or the finished measurements of the piece. But the finished measurements is also depending on your gauge and on your choices. So you need to make sure that you have your measurements and that they actually fit into the pattern, but you can still change the pattern if it's not correct to your measurements. But then in some cases, like socks or a hat, you don't really have a sizing chart and you don't really have a schematic to go by. Then have a look and see if the designer specifies any measurements and check those measurements that you can. And if you don't find any more than just the length or the circumference of a hat, then I would say to do some calculations. For a sock, for example, if they only give you the length, you can use the stitch count in the circumference and divide it by the stitch count per centimeter, and then you will know how many centimeters there will be around the sock. So the width is also important to make a good fitting sock, for example. And the height of the hat is really important to make a good fitting hat. So if you want to have that feeling of wow when you're done knitting, then take your time to take your measurements and make your swatch big enough. I mentioned before that the swatching process is an important part of the knitting, and I know most knitters dread it and often skip it. And that doesn't really help with the final fit. It doesn't help to create the knitted project that you actually want. So there are many different reasons to swatch, and the size or the gauge is just one of them. You will also get a feel for the fabric and to know that you actually have the correct yarn needle combination, or that you have the correct color combination, whatever colors you want to use in your project. So I will say swatch for this reason, but then also swatch because you can practice whatever there is in the project, like cast on or bind off, or the texture stitch, or whatever you feel like. But a swatch can be reasonable when dealing with a big project, such as a cardigan or a sweater, where you actually need it to fit good, to be able to look good on your body. But swatch for a hat or for socks, I mean, why even bother, right? Now, if you do change your knitting approach and start with your own measurements before you even start with a pattern, then you need some place to take the gauge from. So in that case, you actually need to make a swatch for socks or for a hat too. But I will say it's worth it in the end. Here is a swatch of a mini sock that I have made. It's quite wonky. It looks really weird. Doesn't fit on any foot at all. But in this case, I had 3 reasons to swatch. I wanted to know, or this swatch is worked with DP ends. And normally I'm a magic loop sock knitter. So I needed to know if my gauge changed when working with DP ends instead. And I did try another heel than I normally do, another form of a short row heel than I normally do. I wanted to try that one. And then I wanted to see if I actually liked the yarn. So on this sock, I needed a plain strip where I actually can take the gauge on later on, and some other practice. That wasn't meant to happen. Some other practice measurements. So in order to make a good swatch, then keep as many things as possible the same as you will do in your main project. So in this case, I will use DP ends when I knit the actual sock too. And that was one of the variables that I will keep the same as when I did the swatch. But there are more things to think about when swatching. For example, how is your project knitted? Is it knitted flat or in the round or both ways? You need to swatch in the same way as your project is knitted, because your gauge will most likely change depending if you're knitting back and forth or if you're knitting in the round. Most knitter has a little bit looser when knitting in the round, or when knitting flat compared to in the round. So make sure that you swatch both ways if your project has knitting that goes both ways. Otherwise, you will end up with too tight sleeves or a bit too big body on a cardigan. So you need to ensure that you have swatched in both ways and that you know that you have the same gauge. If you don't have the same gauge, then you need to account to make more stitches for the around part if you want to have the same measurements. The difference between flat knitting and in the round knitting, it can be a real tiny one. It can be a quarter of a stitch to 10 centimeters. But when you start adding it up, like for example, around the body, if you have a part going back and forth and then you start knitting in the round, then the gauge will change. So it looks bigger in the part that was knitted back and forth and smaller where it's knitted in the round. So make sure to swatch and either count in to make more stitches in the round or have the same gauge so you don't have to add on stitches. Second thing with the swatch, it's important to make it big enough. You want to be able to measure at least 5 by 5 centimeters on it. Most gauge is given for 10 centimeters, but if you can measure 5 centimeters, then you at least have a good number to go by. I will also say that sometimes it takes a little bit of knitting to go to that happy place with the yarn and the needles. So make sure that you knit until you're actually comfortable with the yarn and the needles. Don't try to just power through, because then you will end up with a different gauge than you will have later on in a project when you're sitting down and relaxed and want to knit something that fits. Some go back to an old project to take their gauge. You can absolutely do that, but make sure that you know that your gauge can change over time. Maybe you adjusted your grip a little bit on your needles. That will adjust your gauge too. And your gauge can also change with hot and cold weather. So if you go back to an old swatch or old garment, sock, whatever, know that your gauge can change a little bit. Third thing about the swatch, you can use different needles to swatch to get different sizes on the gauge, but you can also use different materials on the needles to adjust the gauge a little bit. So metal needles that are quite slick and the yarn easily slips off from, they have a slightly different gauge than a bamboo or a wood needle. So that can also be a way to adjust the gauge just a little bit to change the material, and make sure that you like the combination between the needle and the yarn. And also make sure that you have some needles that you actually like, because without the needles we can't knit, and that won't really help with our knitting experience if we're just having some needles that, oh, they will do for now. But it's a good thing to invest in some needles that you actually like and that you want to use all the time, because that makes knitting much more pleasurable. And the fourth thing, I was touched this a little bit before, be mindful about your mood when sitting down and making a swatch. If you're sitting there tensed and you just want to power through this swatch as quickly as you can, it's likely that you will tension your gauge a little bit. You will hold the yarn a little bit firmer than you do while knitting the big project later on. So make sure to relax and take this swatch to your happy place too. And that goes for all your knitting. Don't knit when you have your ears straight under your shoulders straight under your ears, because your knitting will be much more tense. Take a few minutes to relax and go into a comfortable zone before you even start knitting. That will make your gauge more even and to keep better in the long run. Knitting is a great way to unwind and relax after a day's work or whenever you like. But if you're tensed and stressed, then take a few minutes before you start knitting to enjoy some deep breathing or do a few stretches to just come down and make the knitting enjoyable. Okay, so how do you go about to actually measure the gauge? Well, I said before that I will make at least so I can measure 5 by 5 centimeters. And then I will have my swatch washed and blocked the way I want to treat the finished project. And then you need a tape measure. And what I do is that I do it like this. I place my tape measure down and I start counting the stitches. And on this, I counted the stitches on the swatch below. And here I got to 12 stitches on the 5 centimeters. And even though the tape measure is on the white swatch, I still counted for the blue one when I did the rounds. So I just wanted to show you on 2 different swatches. But what you can see is you count the row numbers from either from 0 to 5 or from 5 to 0, depending on if you want to go up or down. But I counted for the blue one and I come to the conclusion that I had 17 rounds in 5 centimeters. But in this case, the numbers are for 5 centimeters. And we still need to convert them into 10 centimeters to be able to get the gauge that most patterns work with. So 5 times 2 gives us 10. So what we want to do is take the numbers we got from the swatch and multiply them by 2. So the stitch count will be 12 times 2, and that gives us 24. And the row count gives us 17 times 2, and that will give us 34. So on that swatch, I had 24 stitches per 10 centimeters and 34 rounds per 10 centimeters. But if you want to use your gauge with your measurements, then you want to have the stitches per centimeter. I will answer your question in a short while, Linda, and you will understand it too. If you want to use it with your measurements, then you want it per centimeters. You don't want it per 10 centimeters because then we'll need to measure per 10 centimeter too. So what I do is that I actually count the gauge down to per centimeter. And in this case, there will be 2.4 stitches per centimeter and 3.4 rounds. So I divide it by 10. And that makes it a lot more easier to multiply it by the measurements later on if I still use the centimeters for my measurements. Okay, how important is the row count? Well, if you want it to be like you want to make a bust dart, for example, then you will need the row count to calculate how high that will be. Or if you want to know how much yarn you will need in a project, then you will have to know the row count too. Because if the row count is off, it's most likely that you will use more or less yarn than what the designer has said before. Or, yeah, but I know it can be hard to get the same row count, even though you have the same stitch count. But just beware that it will change. It will change how much yarn you will use in the project, and it can change the height of different things. For example, like the sleeves, then you will have decreases going down the sleeve in a certain row number. If the row count is off, then the sleeve can be longer or shorter than what the designer has said. If the designer is only using the rows as their measurement on the sleeves. Does that answer your question? Yeah, perfect. I had another question sent to me from via mail, and that was just the thing that I talked a little bit around here. How will I know that I have enough yarn for my projects? And that can be a quite tough question. If you have some yarn in your stash, you want to know that there will be enough for the project that you have in mind for it. I have a few different ways to go about, because playing in yarn chicken is never a fun thing to do, and you want to have enough project to actually finish. Now, the first thing that most people do is actually to go onto like Ravelry or have a look at different patterns and see how much yarn a similar project use, like the similar gauge and the similar shaping. That will give you an estimation. It won't give you exactly how much. If you want to know exactly how much, then the best way is to actually calculate how many stitches you will have in your project and find out how much yarn each stitch use, and then multiply. But that quickly becomes a huge task if you want to have all the increases and decreases done for that thing. What you can do is to count approximately how many 10 by 10 centimeter squares that goes into your project. So you estimate, okay, this sweater will have approximately this many 10 by 10 squares, or this hat will have approximately this many 10 by 10 squares. And then based off your gauge, you will know how many stitches you have in each 10 by 10 square. I will give you an example later on, so you don't have to remember everything I say now. You will have an example to actually show you this. But once you have all done all that, so you have all the approximately how many stitches you have in there, you still need to find out how much yarn one stitch use to, or I have done 10 stitches and I've taken the length of that. But I will explain that a little bit more, I think. What I've done is I knit 10 stitches on my swatch or on something where I want to know the gauge. I knit 10 stitches, I unravel the 10, and I measure how much yarn did that 10 stitches use up. And you can do this a couple of times if you're unsure that you have the right gauge, but as long as you keep the gauge pretty much the same, then you will have how much yarn 10 stitches will use. And now I've taken, let me share my screen here again, a sock, and I place down the tape measure on it. So on the sock, I will have approximately 3.5 10 by 10 squares per side. So that gives me 7 10 by 10 squares for one sock. You can check just from your measurements how many squares there will be. I just happen to have a sock that I can show you this on. What I will do then, I will share the whiteboard with you so you can have a bit of writing done here. What you will do then, now we know I have seven squares per sock. That gives me 14 squares for the pair. So in my square, I have my gauge to know how many stitches I will use. And my gauge was 36 stitches and 49 rounds or rows. So in one 10 by 10 square, I have 36 times 49. to give me how many stitches in a square. And that gives me 1,764 stitches per 10 by 10 square. So given that, I want to know how many stitches I have total in the project, just approximately. So that will give me 14 times 1,764. And now I was almost falling off my chair when I realized how many stitches there are in a pair of socks, but it's quite a lot. It's 24,696 stitches. But I had my yarn length in 10 centimeters. So I need to divide these, or not in 10 centimeters, I had them per 10 stitch. I knit 10 stitches to find out how long the yarn was after that. After the 10 stitches, I measured how much yarn I had used. So I divide this with 10, 24,696 divided by 10. And that gives me approximately 2,470 stitches. And then I take it times how long the yarn was. And my yarn was 10.2 centimeters. Now it's important to remember this is centimeters. So this was the second time I almost fall off my chair when calculating everything, because I got the number 25,194. And before I realized it was centimeters I was talking about, I was just, no, it can't be true. I can't use that many meters in a pair of socks. But centimeters, yes, and that will give us 252 meters. And for a pair of socks, that's quite reasonable, I will think. I checked this backwards again. So I've taken the measurements to come about that I have about 3.5 squares per side of the sock. But then I checked it backwards too. So why did that change? I wanted to change over here. So based on the weight of the sock, the pair of sock, it weighed 64 grams. And you have a sock yarn with 4 meters per gram, and 4 meters per gram equals, in this case, that I have used 256 meters for my pair of socks. And with my calculation, I came up with 252. And I think a difference of 4 meters can actually be okay. I have a question if you can weigh your swatch, and yes, you can do that if you know how many stitches there are in the swatch. But if you knitted you can weigh your swatch if you want to, and you can find out how many stitches you have in there to know how much yarn you will use too. But if you haven't made a swatch yet, if you're still trying to figure out how you can use the yarn, then this will be easier or a little bit quicker than to do an entire swatch. Or you still need a gauge, so you need to have it something to measure it from. So if you weigh your swatch, then figure out how many stitches you have in the swatch to know how much yarn each stitch uses, the same way I did with just knitting 10 stitches. But this is not something that I do for all my knits, because I also just want to cast on and sit down and knit and enjoy. So even though I want to be a better knitter and have something that fits in the end, it's not something that I do all the time. I will give you one last tip about swatching. And if you are anything like me, you have a terrible memory and can't remember which needles you used with each swatch. I tried to say that, but this time I will remember. No, it doesn't happen. I tried to note it down in Ravelry, and I never really remember to do that either, and in a notebook, and I never find it afterwards. What I've come up with is that I needed an easy thing that I can do on the go and that didn't require anything else than just the yarn and the needles. So maybe you saw it before. I have this small loops on the end here. So what I do is actually to leave a very long end when I finished with my swatch, and I tie a knot for every millimeter that my needle is. So on here I have 3 knots, and then I add a loop for every 0.25 millimeter. So I have 325, 350, 375 on this swatch. And that will keep with the swatch. It won't, well, if you're very uncareful when you wash it or block it, then these loops can fall out, but that is still better to have something, and you can add them on after you washed the swatch. So on here I have 4 knots, and it can be hard to see on the camera, but there are 4 knots here. So this was a 4 millimeter needle. So even if I forget about the swatch for a while, I can still go back and see, but this I knitted with 4 millimeters. So that will be easier for me than to go and guess whatever size I knit this with. I got a thumbs up on that, so I'm happy. That was a good trick then. Now, onto some more fit and ease issues. Because the biggest thing that actually will affect your knit is what ease and what fit you are after. And that will be applicable to your measurements too. So without your measurements, you're only guessing what ease and fit the sweater you're knitting will have. Or if you're knitting a hat, or if you're knitting a mitten. If you don't use your measurements and don't know your measurements, my guess is that your product will be either a little bit too small or a little bit too big. It's hard to be perfect on spot. But when you know your measurements, it's easier to adjust things to actually fit you. And when you are knitting, you are in control of your knitting. So why not take it and actually make some things that fits you? The only person who can say how you like your clothes to fit, that is you. A pattern can give you some measurements and how much ease is used in the pattern, but it can only say, but you are the one that can say that if you like it like this, or if you want to change it in some way. One of the easiest things to change in a pattern is to actually knit a different size. That will change the ease or the finished ease in the project. But even though you know your measurements, you can't knit really skin tight because that will be uncomfortable to wear. You need to add at least 5 centimeters of positive ease to be able to move around in whatever you have knit, or not whatever you have knit. It's for a sweater or for a garment of any type of sorts. And if you want to knit something that you use for outerwear, then I would say add at least 10 centimeters positive ease, because you want to have something below it too. You want to have another sweater, or you want to have something else going underneath it. Then you will need some more positive ease. But there are some things that actually need negative ease to stay in place. And that is hats, mittens, and socks. Because if they have positive ease, then they will fall off every time you move or try to do something. or your hat will slide down in your eyes, and that's not so comfortable. You actually need to have some negative ease in those to make them fit properly. Okay, so we set mittens and socks and hats aside for a little bit, and we talk more about garments, because then we will have more positive ease most of the times, and that is what I'm talking about when I go through this rest of the things. When you look at a pattern that you would like to knit, you most likely will find any sorts of schematics or size charts, and that states which measurement the designer has used when designing the pattern. So if you want something, knit something with more or less ease, you can still use the sizes that the designer have put out, just to knit a different size. But you can't do that every time. But if you can, that's an easy way to go about it. Well, you can also affect your gauge to make a different fit of your finished projects, or choose a different fiber that will make your knit look a little bit different. If you're using wool, then it will have one feel. If you're using silk, it will have a lot more drape. But then there's also numerous ways to add short rows and increases and decreases to shape the fit of a garment. You can add short rows to add height in the neck of a sweater, no matter if you're doing it from top down or bottom up. You will still place the short rows here in the neck. If you're going from bottom up, you will start with the long short rows and move your way to the shorter ones. And if you're using a top-down method and you cast on from the neck, you most often do the short ones first and then move on to longer ones when you're going around. So that's a good way to actually change the fit a little bit of a garment. It increases the height in the neck so that it sits better, and you will have some room for your front to actually fit better. And then you can use bust darts to alter the fit of a sweater. I mean, I say sweater, but it works for a pullover or cardigan or whatever. But bust darts can be something that is a mystery until you actually understand them. But no, not all knitters need to put in bust darts. Even if it's in a pattern, you don't have to do them all the time. But how will you find out if you actually need to do them? Well, I will say that if you wear a skin tight t-shirt and it tends to ride up in the front, so the front side sits a little bit higher than the back, then you will need to add some bust darts to accomplish with this. And the height of the bust dart is approximately the height of this t-shirt riding up. You can also use your measurements again. If you measure from your shoulder seam down to your front, and you find that that is longer than doing the same measurement on your back, you measure to the same point on your hip, and there you will also find out how much more you can need to add in the front. And most of the time, this measurement is added just a couple of inches or 2 to 5 centimeters below where you split for the arms. That is where you put in the bust darts. And the bust darts can also be shaped by short rows. So when you use short rows to shape the bust dart, I think I will draw this actually, because I think it's visual a little bit more. If this can work. Nope. Then we'll make it even harder. Okay. If you're using short rows to form your bust darts, you will add them in by going back and forth from this, then make them longer again. Now they're very separated, and it will only be for a short version of your of your sweater. And this will make that you have more fabric going here than you have out here. So what it essentially does is that it adds almost like a small heel on your, of course, it's not a heel, it's not that pointy, it's not that small, but it adds room in the front of your sweater. And that will give you more space in the front. And then you'll have even more shaping opportunities on the waist shaping. And depending on your body type and your measurements, you might want to put them in and you might not want to put them in. And that is totally up to you. You might want to put in some shaping on your back because that will suit your body a bit better if you have a slight curve going very exaggerated, but then having some shaping in your back actually can make the sweater fit nicely on your back. But maybe you don't want to add any waist shaping on your front. And then that is totally up to you. But use your measurements, know where your sweater will end up, take that circumference and compare it to higher up to see if you actually want to have some increases or decreases on your waist. And you don't have to use only like this first decrease and then increase, or whichever way you want to go. You can also add just increases and do a slightly A shape for it. Or you can use more of decreases even if you have a narrower waist. But it starts with that you know your measurements. And when you start using your measurements, then you will have a more pleasant wearing experience. And you will also have this amazing feeling of, I actually made this. So when you put on your sweater or mitten or hat or whatever, then you will have that feeling. I made this, I'm proud of this. And it fits me the way I want it to. So in order to make your knitted items fit the best, I would say start with your measurements and work with different ways to shape your fabric, your knitted fabric, to make it fit the best you can. And only by knowing your measurements, you can actually do this. So take the time to take your measurements and actually make your garments fit. Now, do you have any more questions on this? Anything you want me to clarify a little bit? I will talk a little bit longer and you will have some time to figure out if you have something more to ask. Because now you know which way to go to make better fitting garments and what's important in order to make that. And you can go ahead and make that for yourself. But if you want someone to actually hold your hand a little bit, someone who's taken all the steps before, then I have an offer for you so that you can continue to do this journey together with me. I'm relaunching my workshop Fabulous Socks in 2 weeks' time. And I know it's about socks, or the main product is socks, but you can use these techniques that you learn from this workshop in any knitting that you would like. So even if the product is sock, the techniques can be usable to any knitting that you like. So in Fabulous Socks, I know most people consider socks to be this easy project that you can just go about and have with you everywhere. And it is. You can just take the techniques where you actually do some measurements and make them work perfectly for you. And then they will be your perfect to go to pattern again, or to go to project again. And Fabulous Socks is not really any other workshop that you have been to, or because it's hosted completely online. You will get access to video training. That means that you can take this course in your own pace. You can do it a few rounds and then start something else and then come back to it later, because it will be there. It will be there waiting for you. You have access to this workshop for life. And that means that you can go back to it again and again and again. You don't have to remember everything that's been taught to you at the time being, because that will mean that's the beauty of the internet, that you can come back to it and rewatch it and see it again and maybe open your eyes for a different technique. So we all seen how many stitches go into a pair of socks, or at least when I knit them. So it's really important to know that you have the right fit when you actually try to make them. And in Fabulous Socks, you will get a new technique to measure your sock, or measure your foot, to calculate your sock. And once you learn that, you can use the same technique on your own socks or any socks that you want to knit to someone else too. And this technique works for any gauge and any pattern that you would like to do. So what's included in Fabulous Socks? Well, it's several training videos. We have 2 longer ones that you can watch for whatever direction you want to knit your socks. And then there are smaller clips going depending on how you want to knit your socks. And there are several videos for different kinds of heels that you can put in. And all of this is calculated and based on your foot. So you will get the perfect fit with whatever heel you want to use, or whatever structure you want to use. And there are more. After you complete the second training video, you will get a Zoom call with me so we can go over all your calculations and how to make your sock perfect for you. And then there are weekly Q&As, so you can ask your questions there too if you would like. And last but not least, there is a very comprehensive workbook that you will use to make your socks fit you, with instructions both from toe up and cuff down, and different heels, and all the calculations that you need to do. So I saw that I had a question, and I will read that and I will try to answer it the best I can. And please feel free to ask me more questions. If there's anything you wonder about Fabulous Socks or about this workshop, then put them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them. So if I want to knit a sweater with different structure, how will I do then? Change needles or change stitches, stitch count? Well, you can go either way. It's the beauty of it. But if you think about if someone have like color work on their sweater and then switch to just plain knitting, then most of the time they use a slightly bigger needle on the color work before they go on to the plain knitting. So they actually change the needle size, but you can also add stitches before your color work and change the gauge like that. So the most important thing is that you have enough stitches to make the measurements that you want to meet. So if this structure changes your gauge in any way, you go either by changing the gauge, by actually changing the needles to make the gauge smaller or bigger, or you go about to change the stitch count to make it fit the final measurements. Did that make sense? Did I answer your question? Let's see, I can't see the name here. Annika, was that okay? Anyone else for a question? That was very quiet. So I think I covered most of it then. I would really like to see you in Fabulous Socks so we can continue on this journey to make more custom fit knits that will fit your measurements. And I will be here answering your questions. And if you have more questions, you can put them in the Facebook group. Or if you have some other questions, just feel free to DM me or send an email. I will do my best to answer. But my biggest wish is that you will start making some custom fit knits to make them fit you, because that will give you the greatest feeling when you're actually done knitting with all your knits and all your projects. So I wish you a very happy evening, and I hope to see you in Fabulous Socks. So happy knitting. See you later. Bye.